A young boy's miraculous return from death has left everyone reeling, not just because he survived, but because of the chilling warning he brought back with him. He claims to have seen heaven, but what he says he witnessed there is far from comforting. What message could be so horrifying that it shakes even the most faithful? Is this a glimpse into something we're not ready to understand? Hi, my name's Ethan. I was just 10 years old when I died. Yeah, 10. Feels unreal. Up until that day, I was just your average kid, full of curiosity, buzzing with energy, and constantly on the lookout for the next fun thing to do. It was one of those golden afternoons where everything felt alive and exciting. The kind of day where you just know it's going to be perfect. My friends and I were tearing through our quiet little neighborhood on our bikes, racing like we were competing for Olympic gold, laughing so hard it hurt. We didn't have a single worry in the world. Then in a split second, everything changed. I can still hear it. The screech of tires, the terrifying metallic crash, and then complete silence. All it took was me darting across the street without checking for cars. I didn't even see it coming. The driver hit the brakes, but it was already too late. And you know what? I don't even remember the impact. All I knew next was darkness. Later, my parents told me how it went down. I was flung several feet, hitting the pavement hard. My heart had stopped by the time the paramedics showed up. There I was, lying motionless in the middle of the street. Neighbors rushed outside, my mom's screams cutting through the air like a knife. People were panicking, crying, praying, desperately hoping for a miracle, while paramedics fought to bring me back. But I wasn't aware of any of that chaos. I was somewhere else entirely. It's tough to explain, but imagine feeling completely weightless, like you're floating. No pain, no fear, just this surreal calm washing over you. It felt like I'd stepped out of my own body and into, well, somewhere completely different. My parents later told me my pulse was gone for several minutes. Minutes! The doctors were stunned I even made it, let alone without brain damage. During those few minutes, I had an experience so profound it became a message, maybe even a warning, that I've carried with me ever since. It all started when my world went dark and I found myself in a place I didn't even know could exist. When the darkness lifted, I wasn't where I had been. This wasn't Earth. I could feel it instantly. The air, if you could call it that, was different. I wasn't standing on anything, but I wasn't falling either. And then the light. It wasn't like sunlight, not even close. This light was everywhere. It surrounded me, filled me, became me. It wasn't just something I saw, it was something I felt. Safe, peaceful, like I was wrapped in the warmest hug imaginable. That's when I knew deep down, this wasn't the world I had left behind. As I stood there soaking it all in, I realized something else. I wasn't alone. At first I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them. It's hard to explain, but their presence was undeniable. Calm, comforting, almost as if they were excited I was there. Then slowly, shapes started forming in the light. These weren't people as we know them. Their forms were soft, glowing, almost like they were made of the very same light that surrounded us. One of them moved closer to me, and I felt like I knew them. They radiated this incredible sense of love and peace, so strong it instantly melted away any fear or confusion I might have had. For the first time, I didn't feel lost or out of place. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. This being didn't say anything, but somehow they showed me things. It was like they were helping me understand something, showing me truths I hadn't even thought to ask about. Images and feelings hit me all at once like a flood I couldn't stop. I saw moments from my life, some so clear I could almost feel myself living them again, and others I didn't even remember. Then everything shifted. The images changed. Suddenly I was seeing things I didn't understand. Faces of people I didn't know, places I'd never been. Some of it was as radiant and beautiful as the light-filled place I was in, but some of it wasn't. There was darkness, a shadow creeping over the world. I saw people fighting, their faces twisted with anger, fear, and pain. I tried to make sense of it all, but before I could even form a question, more images and feelings washed over me. This time, it wasn't just memories or visions. It was a message. No words, but the meaning was crystal clear. Something big was coming. a change, a test for everyone. And it wasn't far off. The urgency was almost unbearable, like an invisible clock ticking down. I had to do something, but what? Before I could even begin to figure it out, I locked eyes with the being again. Their gaze was filled with so much love, but also a deep sadness. I could feel it. This was something I couldn't ignore. Then I felt it, a pull. Something was calling me back, tugging at me like a magnet. I didn't want to leave. The peace, the love I felt in this place, it was so perfect that the thought of going back felt wrong. But the pull only grew stronger, and I realized I didn't have a choice. The being gave me one last look. They didn't say anything, but somehow I knew what they meant. It wasn't my time yet. I needed to go back and carry the message with me. The light around me became brighter and brighter until it was all I could see. And then, just like that, it was over. The light vanished, and suddenly I was back, gasping for air like I'd been underwater too long. My chest felt like it was on fire. My head was spinning, and through the noise, I could hear my mom sobbing nearby. I didn't fully understand what had just happened, but there was one thing I knew for certain. That place I'd been, it was real. So real it was now burned into me, impossible to forget. And I'd returned with a message I knew the world needed to hear. When I opened my eyes, everything hit at me at once. The world felt heavy, solid. Nothing like the weightless, peaceful place I'd just left. I realized I was lying on the ground, and the chaos around me came flooding in. Sirens wailed in the distance. Voices were everywhere. Someone was shouting instructions. My chest ached with every breath. My whole body felt bruised, and it took me a moment to process one crucial fact. I had survived. I didn't say a word at first. My parents were right there, clutching my hand, crying so hard their shoulders shook. Paramedics worked quickly to lift me onto a stretcher, but I couldn't stop looking at my parents' faces. I'll never forget their expressions, a mix of pure relief and disbelief, like they couldn't decide whether to cry harder or just hug me forever. They rushed me to the hospital, and as the doctors and nurses worked around me, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. I overheard bits of conversations. Miracle, no pulse, cardiac arrest. That's when I found out. I'd been clinically dead for several minutes. To everyone else, I was a medical anomaly. How had I even come back, and without any apparent damage? But for me, it wasn't a mystery. I knew exactly why I'd been sent back. It wasn't until much later, when the doctors had left and my parents were sitting quietly beside me, that I found the courage to speak up. At first, I didn't know where to start. How do you explain something so beyond words to people who weren't there? A part of me was terrified they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they'd think I'd made it all up. But the memory of the light, the beings, and that message was too vivid to keep bottled up. "I need to tell you something," I finally said. My parents turned to me immediately, their eyes filled with concern. When I was gone, I wasn't really gone, I managed to say, my words tumbling out slowly. My mom's hand found mine, her grip soft but trembling. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," she said gently, her voice breaking. I shook my head. "No, I need to," I whispered. I took a breath and started again. I saw something. It wasn't just a dream, and it wasn't in my head. It was real. I was in this place, I continued. It was filled with light, and there were beings. They weren't like people, but they felt alive and they showed me things. I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say, and they gave me a message, a warning. My dad leaned in closer, his forehead creased with concern. "What kind of warning?" he asked, his voice low. I swallowed hard, trying to put the message into words. "They showed me the world, our world, and how it's changing. There's a leader, someone who's going to rise up and divide people. They said this person will bring out the best and the worst in everyone. It's going to be a test for all of us." My parents exchanged a nervous glance. I could see they were trying to make sense of what I was saying. To them, it probably sounded like the ramblings of a shaken kid who'd just been through something unimaginable. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The images, the feelings, they were still so vivid. What stood out the most was the shadow. I kept seeing it, creeping over the world like an unstoppable force. dark and suffocating. I saw people arguing, fighting, turning on each other. Fear and anger seemed to take over everything. But in the middle of all that, there were moments of hope. I saw people standing together, choosing love over fear, refusing to let the darkness win. It was like the future wasn't set. There were different paths the world could take, depending on the choices we made as a whole. And then there was the figure, the leader. I didn't know who they were, but their presence was impossible to ignore. They felt larger than life, powerful in a way that sent shivers down my spine. This person, whoever they were, was going to change everything. The message was too big to keep to myself, so I started telling more people about what I had seen. Not everyone believed me. Some shrugged it off as a hallucination, a trick my brain had played while I was so close to death. Others were curious, even intrigued, but didn't know what to think. A few, though, really listened. They didn't just hear me, they understood. To them, it wasn't just a wild story. It was a warning. The message wasn't meant for just me, it was for everyone. And deep down, I could feel that the events I'd been shown had already started to unfold. The years passed and life carried on. But no matter how much time went by, I couldn't forget. At first, I didn't fully understand what I was supposed to do with it. But as I got older, something changed. It was like I'd been given a new way of seeing the world. Patterns, connections, cracks that most people didn't notice. The warning stayed with me, a quiet but persistent whisper in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop wondering, was the leader I'd seen already here, quietly making their way to power? Then came the 2016 elections. Donald Trump became president of the United States. I remember sitting in front of the TV, watching the results roll in. It wasn't about whether I liked or disliked him at the time. It was something else, something tied to that vision, to the message I'd been carrying all these years. I was still trying to piece it all together, but for the first time, I started to wonder if the leader I'd seen in my vision wasn't just a possibility anymore. What struck me most wasn't Donald Trump himself. It was how people reacted to him. The division, the endless arguments, the sheer intensity of emotion he sparked in people. It hit me like a wave of deja vu. It felt eerily similar to the images I'd been shown during my near-death experience. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the moment I'd been warned about. The figure from my vision, the one who would rise and divide, no longer felt like a vague symbol. I couldn't prove it, but deep down I had this unsettling certainty. Donald Trump was the leader I'd seen. It wasn't about whether he was good or bad. It was about what his presence represented for humanity. He was a catalyst, a force that made people face their deepest fears, their core beliefs, and their values. As the months rolled by, I started noticing how much of what I'd been shown in that other place was playing out in real life. The shadow from my vision wasn't just about one person. It was about us. It was about how people responded to each other, how fear and anger spread like wildfire. I saw it everywhere. Families breaking apart over political disagreements, friendships ending because of opposing views. The world felt heavier, more hostile than it ever had before. I kept thinking back to what the beings in the light had shown me. They never said whether the leader was good or evil. That wasn't the point. They had told me this leader would bring a test, a moment of reckoning for all of us. At first, I didn't fully understand what they meant, but as I watched the world react to Trump's presidency, the pieces started to click. He reflected back the fears, the divisions, and the anger that were already there, forcing people to confront themselves. And that's what made him so significant. He wasn't just a leader, he was a test. It all felt so familiar. The arguing, the shouting, people turning against each other. It reminded me of the images from my vision. But just like in those glimpses of the future, there were also moments of hope. I saw people coming together in ways I hadn't seen before, standing up for what they believed in, fighting for justice and equality. It was as if the world was splitting into two paths, and humanity was being forced to choose which one to take. One night, I had a long talk with my mom about it. She'd always been supportive, even when she didn't fully understand the weight of what I'd experienced. "Do you really think he's the one from your vision?" she asked, her voice gentle but serious. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it feels like it. It's not just about him, though. It's about what he represents. It's about how we, as people, respond to him and to each other. I paused, thinking back to the beings in the light. They didn't tell me everything, but they made one thing clear. This leader would be a test, and I think we're living through that test right now. She nodded, her eyes a mix of concern and understanding. So what do we do? I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. What I do know is that the choices we make during times like this will shape the future in ways we can't even begin to comprehend. The beings showed me two possible worlds, one where darkness spread unchecked, fueled by fear and anger, consuming everything in its path. But they also showed me another world, a brighter one, where people came together, where love and compassion won out over hate. The choice wasn't up to one person. It wasn't just about a leader. It was up to all of us. Donald Trump's presidency wasn't just a political event. It was something deeper. It was like the universe shouting at us to wake up, to realize that the choices we make, how we treat each other, what we fight for, matter. As divided as the world seemed, there were still glimmers of hope. I saw people choosing kindness over anger, courage over fear. I saw people standing up for what's right, refusing to let hate have the final say. And I think that's the real message the beings wanted me to understand and to share. We're being tested, not just by what's happening around us, but by what's inside us, our own hearts, our own minds. And the outcome? That's up to all of us. What comes next? That's the question that keeps me going. I don't have all the answers. Honestly, I don't think anyone does. The beings didn't show me how this ends, because it hasn't been decided yet. It's still being written, shaped by the choices we make every single day. And maybe that's why I was sent back. Not to predict the future, but to remind people that they have the power to shape it. I don't know what will happen with Donald Trump, or with the leaders who come after him. I don't know if the shadow will keep growing, or if the light will finally push it back. But there's one thing I do know. We're all part of this. Every action, every word, every choice, it all matters. The beings didn't give me a list of instructions. They didn't tell me exactly what to do. What they gave me was a message. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even the smallest light can make a difference in the darkest places. So, I keep moving forward. I keep sharing my story, even when it's hard, and I try to live by the message I was given. It's not always easy. There are days when it feels like too much, when the weight of it all is overwhelming. But then I think back to the light, the love and peace that filled that place. And I know it's worth it. Ethan's story makes you stop and think, what's really going on when someone brushes so close to death? Believe it or not, around 9 million people in the United States have reported experiencing something life-changing during a near-death moment. And scientists? They're still scratching their heads, trying to decode what's actually happening in the brain during these events. Even way back in ancient times, people were fascinated by this. Take the philosopher Socrates, for example. At the end of the Republic, he shares the story of a warrior named This guy was declared dead after a battle, but 12 days later, he wakes up and starts talking about what he saw in another realm. According to him, his soul left his body and entered this strange, otherworldly space. There, people were being judged for their actions on Earth, and glowing divine figures floated down from above. Tale might sound like a mythical bedtime story, but the surprising thing is that people across the globe and throughout history have shared similar experiences. From ancient Greece to today, survivors of near-death moments often talk about leaving their physical bodies behind and stepping into a completely different realm. They describe everything from an overwhelming sense of peace to gliding through a dark tunnel toward a bright light, and even reliving life's biggest moments in vivid, mind-blowing detail. Scientists and doctors have a name for this phenomenon: near-death experiences, or NDEs. But what exactly qualifies as an NDE? There's no hard and fast definition, but the term generally refers to deeply spiritual or transformative experiences that occur when someone is on the brink of death. NDEs are most often reported by people who've survived things like severe head trauma or cardiac arrest. Essentially, situations where death is the default unless swift, life-saving action is taken. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist who's been diving deep into the study of NDEs for nearly 5 decades, sums it up perfectly. He says these are events that happen in conditions where you'd be dead for good, if not for emergency medical intervention. Near-death experiences happen way more often than most people realize. A 2011 study published in Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences found that roughly 9 million Americans have had an NDE. These people don't just walk away unchanged. Many describe feeling more alive than ever, embracing life with new enthusiasm, showing deeper compassion, and losing their fear of death altogether. But it's not all epiphanies. For some, the aftermath can be tough. Everyday life might feel dull in comparison, and their transformed outlook can confuse loved ones. Relationships sometimes crumble under the weight of these changes, and even those who felt blissful during the experience can feel upset or angry about returning to life. Over the past 40 years, scientists have been diving into NDEs, but the debate is far from settled. What really happens when we die? It's a question that's been messing with human minds for, well, forever. Over 34,000 years ago, ancient people in Sungir, Russia, buried their loved ones with shiny ivory beads and other cool trinkets. Why? Maybe they thought there was more waiting for us after this life. From ancient texts like the Egyptian Book of the Dead to the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, even the Bible, humans have always wrestled with the idea of life after death. But is there really something on the other side, or is it just wishful thinking? Then there's the whole near-death experience phenomenon. You've probably heard the stories. People talk about a bright light, an overwhelming peace, or seeing loved ones who've passed on. But here's the thing. This isn't just modern-day talk. NDEs go way back. Ancient cultures and religions have been documenting this stuff forever, trying to piece together whether these moments are a glimpse of the afterlife or just our brains playing tricks. Fast forward to the 18th century, and science finally decided to get involved. In 1740, Pierre-Jean de Monchaux, a French military doctor, recorded what's considered the first medical account of an NDE. One of his patients, who fainted after losing way too much blood during a fever treatment, came back with a jaw-dropper of a story. He described seeing the most beautiful, pure light and said it felt like heaven, literally the nicest moment of his life. De Monchaux, trying to make sense of it, figured it might have something to do with blood rushing to the brain. He even compared it to survivors of drowning or extreme cold, who reported similar feelings. So what's the deal? Are these near-death experiences proof that there's more to come, or just our bodies glitching out in their final moments? It's a question that still sparks debate, even centuries later. For more than 200 years, near-death experiences didn't get much attention from researchers. That all changed in 1975 when psychiatrist Raymond Moody dropped a bombshell of a book called Life After Life. He didn't just write about these experiences. He gave them a name: near-death experiences. In fact, Moody's work became the foundation for how we understand NDEs today. He described how survivors often shared similar stories, feelings of overwhelming peace and love, seeing dead relatives, and even reaching some kind of boundary that felt like the ultimate point of no return. Since then, research has poured in, and guess what? Most of it backs up Moody's descriptions. The question isn't whether these experiences happen. The real debate is about what they mean. Now let's rewind a bit. For most of human history, death wasn't exactly a complicated concept. It was seen as final, simple, done. Sam Parnia, a big name in critical care and resuscitation research at NYU Langone Health, sums it up pretty well. Back then, when people died, whether it was from an accident, war, or an infection, it all came down to one thing: their heart stopped. And when that happened, it was game over. Here's the science behind it. The heart, lungs, and brain are like a tightly linked trio. If one fails, the others quickly follow, like a chain reaction. Even today in most hospitals, a patient is officially declared dead the moment their heart stops beating. But is that really the end? Modern medicine is starting to suggest otherwise, and that's where things get really interesting. So is death still as final as it used to be? Or are we just scratching the surface of what happens when life, as we know it, hits pause? Let's talk about a game changer: cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR. In 1960, just 15 years before Raymond Moody introduced us to near-death experiences, doctors figured out that combining chest compressions with mouth-to-mouth breathing could literally bring people back from the brink. CPR flipped the script on death, turning what was once a hard stop into more of a pause button. And that was just the beginning. Add intensive care medicine to the mix, think ventilators and life support machines, and suddenly people who had technically crossed the line into biological death could be brought back. Sam Parnia, one of the leading voices in resuscitation research, believes we're only scratching the surface. He points out that when someone dies, the cells in their body don't instantly shut down. In fact, they can hang on for hours, maybe even days, waiting for the right intervention. In 2019, scientists restored brain activity in pigs more than 10 hours after the animals were declared dead. Let that sink in. Parnia called this discovery Nobel Prize-worthy. With CPR and advanced resuscitation techniques saving more people, researchers now have a treasure trove of data from cardiac arrest survivors. Take a 2001 study in Dutch hospitals. Out of 344 patients who were successfully brought back, 18% described experiencing an NDE. That's nearly 1 in 5. They reported things like peace, light, or even seeing loved ones waiting for them. More recent studies are getting even deeper, aiming to crack the code on what happens to our consciousness when we die. Is it lights out, or is there more going on? It's a question that has haunted humanity for thousands of years, and science is finally getting closer to some answers. To give you a better perspective, hear John's story, for instance. When John was just a toddler, barely 3 years old, his tiny heart stopped. His grandmother still remembers the chaos that erupted, people scrambling to save him, chest compressions, his small body lifeless in blue. They rushed him to the hospital in an ambulance, where doctors fought to bring him back. Thankfully, they did. John recovered, and life slowly returned to normal, or so they thought. One day while playing, John casually turned to his grandmother and said something that stopped her cold. "Grandma, when I died, I saw a lady." Confused and startled, she asked John's mom if anyone had mentioned his cardiac arrest to him. The answer? A firm no. No one had told him anything about what had happened that day, but John wasn't done talking about it. Over the next few months, he kept bringing up details that no one could explain. One moment stands out. He described being in the ambulance, but not in the way you'd expect. He said, "When I was in the doctor's car, the belt came undone, and I was looking down from above." He described watching himself from somewhere up in the air, as though he'd left his body entirely. How could a 3-year-old describe something so vivid and unexplainable? Stories like his add fuel to the mystery of what happens when we approach, or even cross, the threshold of death. Some parts of near-death experiences truly leave scientists scratching their heads. Take John's story, detailed in a 2014 paper by Sam Parnia. It's not just John. Many NDE survivors describe something called a life review, where their entire life seems to play back before their eyes. But people often say they relive these moments through the perspective of others. Parnia explains that during these reviews, you're not just recalling events, you're judging yourself, not based on achievements or failures, but on how you treated others. Imagine feeling the emotions of someone else in response to your actions. That's what leaves researchers baffled. How can someone suddenly recall things they shouldn't even be able to remember, like long-buried childhood moments? Then there's the mind-bending phenomenon of out-of-body experiences, OTOBAs, a hallmark of NDEs. People report feeling as if their consciousness floats above their physical body, sometimes observing what's happening with eerie precision. And these accounts aren't just vague or fuzzy, they're oddly specific. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist who spent decades studying NDEs, recounts a case in his book, After. Holly, a patient who had overdosed, later described a detailed memory of a conversation Grayson had with her roommate while Holly was unconscious, in another room. To make it weirder, she even mentioned the striped tie Grayson had spilt spaghetti sauce on. "I was completely stunned," Grayson admitted. How could Holly know these things if she was unconscious? Stories like this challenge everything we think we know about the brain and consciousness. What if we could test whether near-death experiences actually let people see events from outside their bodies? That's exactly what Sam Parnia tried to figure out in his groundbreaking AWARE study, published in 2014 in the journal Resuscitation. Spanning 15 hospitals, the study was designed to see if patients could report actual, verifiable details of their surroundings during cardiac arrest. Here's how it worked. Hospitals participating in the study placed shelves in emergency rooms and intensive care units, each with unique images, things like religious symbols, animals, or newspaper headlines facing upward. These images could only be seen from a perspective near the ceiling, which is where many out-of-body experiencers say they were during their NDEs. The idea? If someone's consciousness really floats above their body, they might spot these pictures during their experience. Of the 101 cardiac arrest survivors interviewed, the results were mixed. Nearly half had no memory or awareness from their time of unconsciousness. 46% described detailed experiences, but not the classic NDE stories. They recalled things like seeing animals, plants, or feeling intense fear. 9% reported NDEs, which is consistent with what's been found in other studies. One patient's story stood out. A 57-year-old man described what he saw and heard during his resuscitation from what seemed like a vantage point in the top corner of the room. While his account was remarkably accurate, the room he was in didn't have any of the image shelves installed, so researchers couldn't verify if he'd seen the pictures. Interestingly, only 22% of the cardiac events in the study occurred in rooms outfitted with these special shelves, which limited researchers' ability to test this aspect further. While the study didn't provide definitive proof of out-of-body experiences, it took an important step toward testing these claims scientifically. The fact that one patient could describe events from a seemingly impossible perspective raises more questions than answers. No one denies the sheer impact of NDEs. These mystical, often life-altering moments can lead to profound shifts in how people view the world. Survivors frequently report becoming more empathetic, less materialistic, and more focused on meaningful connections than chasing status or wealth. And it's not just those who experience NDEs firsthand. Bruce Grayson highlights how even learning about NDEs can spark change. Studies show that students who explored NDEs became noticeably more compassionate and altruistic, even a year later. The concept of a near-death experience hits something deep within us, Grayson says. It reminds us that we're not just isolated beings. We're part of something much larger. Not all near-death experiences are filled with peace and light. While the blissful, euphoric stories grab the most attention, there's a darker, less talked about side to NDEs. Some are terrifying, marked by feelings of deep isolation, panic, or even excruciating agony. These experiences can haunt people long after they've returned, sometimes leading to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or causing serious disruptions in their lives. Bruce Grayson has seen the impact of these firsthand, sharing how careers have ended because of the turmoil NDEs can create. Many people become so enraptured by their experience that they feel depressed or even angry to be back alive, he says. For them, coming back can feel like a loss rather than a second chance. Even with their emotional intensity, not everyone sees NDEs as brushes with another realm. Many scientists lean on psychology, biology, and neuroscience to explain them. John Martin Fisher, a philosopher at the University of California, Riverside, takes a more pragmatic view. He suggests that the universal themes in NDEs, like tunnels, lights, or life reviews, don't necessarily mean we're connecting to something divine or otherworldly. We're all similar, Fisher explains. Humans share similar developmental histories, psychologies, and brain structures. In short, our brains might simply be wired to react in these specific ways when facing death. Fisher also points out that the looming reality of death plays a huge role in shaping these experiences. When faced with what feels like the end, our biochemistry, neurophysiology, and psychology interact in complex ways to create these vivid and sometimes surreal reactions. The serene tunnel of light or the feeling of floating above the body might just be how our minds process the overwhelming stress of near-death situations. Kevin Nelson, a neurologist at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, argues that near-death experiences fit neatly into the realm of neuroscience. Like philosopher John Martin Fisher, Nelson acknowledges the complexity of these experiences, but suggests they aren't necessarily exclusive to life-threatening situations. In fact, he believes the feeling of being under threat, real or perceived, might be just as crucial as any actual medical danger. The context of the experience, feeling threatened, may be as important as the actual medical threat, Nelson says. His book, The Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, explores this idea further. Nelson points out that similar effects can be triggered under much less dramatic circumstances. For instance, fainting, when studied in the controlled environment of a lab, has been shown to produce the same elements people describe in NDEs. A 1994 study published in The Lancet found that syncope could prompt experiences like feelings of peace, entering another world, or being surrounded by light, hallmarks of classic NDEs. Out-of-body experiences are no exception. While often associated with NDEs, OBEs are surprisingly common in the general population. In a survey of 13,000 people, almost 6% reported having had one. OBEs have also been linked to conditions like epilepsy and sleep paralysis, and scientists have even managed to induce them in the lab. By applying a small electric charge to the temporoparietal cortex, a part of the brain responsible for how we perceive our body in space, researchers have triggered the sensation of floating outside oneself. Nelson notes that OBEs are most likely to happen during the transitional phase between wakefulness and rapid eye movement sleep. These findings suggest that many of the extraordinary features of NDEs might have roots in the way our brains respond to certain triggers, whether they come from a life-threatening situation or something as mundane as fainting. The implications? What feels like a journey into another realm might actually be the brain's reaction to extreme stress or altered states of consciousness. But does that explain everything? Or are there still gaps in the story? The debate rages on. Over the past decade, the line between science and faith has gotten blurrier, thanks to a wave of wildly successful nonfiction about near-death experiences. These books haven't just sparked debates. They've made a lot of money too. One of the biggest hits, Heaven is for Real, tells the story of a 4-year-old boy who claimed to visit heaven after surviving emergency surgery. Published in 2010, it became a massive sensation, selling over 11 million copies and earning a spot as Amazon's 17th best-selling book of all time. If that wasn't enough, Sony turned it into a movie in 2014, which grossed over $100 million worldwide. Another bestseller, Mary Kneels to Heaven and Back, recounts the orthopedic surgeon's NDE after a kayaking accident. Her story struck such a chord that it spent 6 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list in 2012. But perhaps the most talked about book, especially among scientists, is Proof of Heaven by neurosurgeon Eben Alexander. Published in 2012, it describes how Alexander, after falling into a week-long coma from a rare E. coli meningitis infection, experienced what he claims was the afterlife. The book sold nearly 2 million copies, landed him on the cover of Newsweek, and brought him to TV shows like Fox and Friends. Alexander's professional credentials as a neurosurgeon gave his claims a kind of built-in credibility, emphasized in the book's opening by an endorsement from Bill Guggenheim, author of Hello from Heaven, who called Alexander the perfect candidate to share this story. These works have certainly captured the public's imagination, but their popularity has also fueled the ongoing debate. Are these tales glimpses of the afterlife, or simply stories shaped by faith and personal interpretation? The success of these books shows just how deeply NDEs resonate, regardless of whether they're seen as spiritual truths or biological phenomena. It didn't take long for skeptics to challenge Alexander's claims, though. Journalist Luke Dittrich, writing for Esquire, didn't just question the details of Alexander's supposed journey to other realms. He dug into the neurosurgeon's qualifications too. A big part of Alexander's argument is that his brain was so severely damaged by a bacterial infection that consciousness should have been impossible, making his experience more than just a hallucination. But Laura Potter, the doctor who treated him, told Dittrich that things weren't quite as he described. She said Alexander's coma was medically induced, not caused by meningitis, and that he was actually conscious at times during the early days as his anesthesia wore off. This kind of pushback resonates with experts like neurologist Kevin Nelson, who finds such stories troubling. He believes Alexander was likely experiencing delirium and confused it with reality. Philosopher John Fisher doesn't hold back either, pointing out that while a neurosurgeon might know their way around a brain, they're not exactly equipped to tackle the mysteries of metaphysics. Fisher is clear. Alexander's book isn't a scientific analysis, and that's a problem. For Fisher, this debate isn't just about one person's claims. It's about how sensationalized accounts of near-death experiences can play on our deepest fears. These vivid, emotionally charged stories offer tantalizing glimpses of an afterlife, but often sidestep the flaws in their evidence. And when we're scared of death, it's easy to focus on the hope they sell, rather than the questions they leave unanswered. On the flip side, researchers like Sam Parnia are taking a no-nonsense scientific approach to unraveling near-death experiences. His latest project, Aware 2, is pushing the boundaries of what we know. In collaboration with 20 hospitals across the United States and Europe, Parnia's team is using cutting-edge tools like brain oximeters and EEGs to track brain activity during and after cardiac arrest. Parnia's perspective: let science lead the conversation. He believes that hard data should shape our philosophical and spiritual beliefs, not the other way around. And he's not buying the idea that these experiences are just hallucinations. In fact, Parnia avoids using the term near-death experience altogether because of how it's been misused and misunderstood over the years. For him, the real breakthrough lies in the sheer consistency of these accounts. When millions of people across the globe are essentially describing the same thing, it's a signal worth paying attention to, he says. With the right research tools, Parnia believes we can finally start to understand what's really happening in those moments and what they might reveal about human consciousness. Bruce Grayson shares Sam Parnia's stance. He's convinced that near-death experiences aren't hallucinations, often pointing to the eerie accuracy of out-of-body accounts. Still, Grayson admits we're far from proving whether NDEs are actual glimpses of an afterlife. He describes them as deeply personal, subjective events, which means unraveling their meaning will likely remain as much about philosophy as science. When it comes to understanding the dying process itself, hospice physician Christopher Kerr offers a fresh perspective. Dying is a paradox, Kerr says. Physically, the body may be shutting down, but spiritually, something vibrant and deeply human seems to unfold. As the CEO of Hospice and Palliative Care Buffalo, Kerr and his team have explored over 1,500 end-of-life experiences, profound inner events that people often report in their final days, weeks, or even months. Unlike NDEs, end-life experiences don't happen in dramatic, near-death moments. In fact, most people experiencing them are still alert and healthy enough to live their daily lives. Kerr found that nearly 90% of hospice patients shared vivid dreams or visions, often featuring loved ones, both living and deceased. What's striking? The closer someone gets to death, the more likely they are to see loved ones who've passed on. For most, these dreams bring comfort. Over 60% describe them as deeply reassuring. However, about 19% find them unsettling. Still, Kerr emphasizes that end-life experiences, even the difficult ones, can have profound and life-affirming effects. One remarkable case involved an aging veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt. In his final dreams, he was visited by fellow soldiers who brought him a sense of peace and reassurance. For the first time in years, he could sleep. Kerr explains that these experiences, while still mysterious, often help people find meaning, healing, and even acceptance as they approach the end. So is death simply the end, or does it hold a deeper, richer story? For those like Kerr, these vivid inner worlds might just be a glimpse into the answer. When you dive into the science of near-death experiences, hearing the actual stories from those who've lived through them hits differently. One such story is that of Colton Burpo, a spirited 4-year-old whose experience turned his family's quiet, small-town life upside down. The Burpos lived in Imperial, Nebraska, a tight-knit town where life moved at a gentle pace, and everyone knew everyone. Todd Burpo was a man of many roles: pastor, handyman, and above all, a loving dad. His wife, Sonia, juggled her teaching job with raising their little bundle of energy, Colton. Their world was simple but full, revolving around faith, family, and the whirlwind of parenting a young boy. But in the spring of 2023, their steady rhythm came to a screeching halt. What began as a typical childhood illness quickly spiraled into a nightmare. At first, Colton's symptoms seemed harmless enough: a fever, stomachache, and the kind of cranky, miserable look every parent has seen before. Sonia handled it like any mom would, making sure he stayed hydrated and rested. But then things took a sudden, scary turn. Colton's discomfort escalated into intense, stabbing pain that left him writhing on the floor, tears pouring down his face. It wasn't long before Sonia realized this was no ordinary bug. Every instinct she had told her that something was seriously wrong, and the Burpos were about to face a challenge that would shake their faith and change their lives forever. The Burpos' trusted family doctor brushed off Sonia's concerns, chalking up Colton's misery to a simple stomach bug. But Sonia's gut told her otherwise. As Colton's cries grew louder and his pain more intense, her worry turned into sheer panic. By the time Todd walked through the door after work, she didn't ask for his opinion. She made it clear. "We have to go back. Something's not right." This time they skipped the clinic altogether. Racing against time, the Burpos headed straight to Great Plains Regional Medical Center. Sonia sat in the back seat, trying to comfort her writhing little boy, while Todd gripped the wheel, his silent prayers rising with every mile. When they arrived, the truth was worse than they could have imagined. Colton's appendix had ruptured, flooding his tiny body with a dangerous infection. The only way to save him was through emergency surgery, but the odds weren't in their favor. The news hit them like a tidal wave. Sonia held Colton close, whispering through tears, trying to reassure him, and maybe herself, that everything would be okay. Meanwhile, Todd found himself in the hospital chapel, leaning on the faith that had guided him his whole life, praying with every ounce of strength he had. The hospital, with its sterile walls and cold fluorescent lights, became their battleground. For Colton, it was a fight for his life. For Todd and Sonia, it was a desperate struggle to hold on to hope. Would their little boy make it through the night? In the operating room, the surgical team worked against the clock, but the situation was spiraling fast. The infection had spread farther than they anticipated, and Colton's heart rate kept dipping dangerously low. Every sound from the monitors felt like a gut punch, a grim reminder of just how delicate his condition was. Meanwhile, outside in the waiting room, Todd paced relentlessly, caught in a tug-of-war between fear and faith. Sonia, tears streaming, worked her phone like a lifeline, reaching out to family and friends, pleading for prayers and support. After what felt like hours stretching into days, the surgeon finally stepped into the waiting room. "Colton's alive," he said. Relief hit Todd and Sonia like a wave, but the doctor's tone carried a warning. Recovery wouldn't be easy and the road ahead was uncertain. What they couldn't know then was that surviving surgery was only the beginning of a far more incredible journey. As Colton slowly began to heal, he started saying things that left his parents speechless. One day he looked at Todd and said, "Daddy, I saw you pacing and praying in the waiting room." Todd stopped cold. Then Colton turned to Sonia, adding, "And you were crying on the phone." The room went still. How could he possibly know? Colton had been unconscious the entire time, yet his descriptions weren't vague guesses. They were chillingly accurate, down to the smallest detail. Colton's revelations didn't end with his uncanny observations about the waiting room. He went on to describe floating above his body during surgery, watching as the doctors worked urgently to save him. He spoke of the tools they used, the tension in their movements, and the expressions on their faces. All things he couldn't have seen while unconscious. But the real jaw-dropper came when Colton began describing a place beyond anything his parents could comprehend. "It was so bright," he said, his little voice filled with wonder, "but it didn't hurt my eyes." He spoke of music that made him feel safe, like the sound itself was embracing him. There were radiant angels who sang songs that filled him with happiness. And then he dropped a bombshell. "I met Jesus." Colton's description was vivid and childlike. "He has kind eyes and brown hair," he said earnestly, "and he showed me the marks on his hands and feet." Todd and Sonia sat in stunned silence, trying to process the enormity of what their son was saying. And then Colton shared something that rocked Sonia to her core. "I met my sister," he said one day, catching her completely off guard. "She hugged me and told me she can't wait for you to come to heaven." Sonia froze. Years earlier, she had suffered a miscarriage, a heartbreak so private that even Colton didn't know about it. Yet here he was, describing a sister he could have no way of knowing existed. "She looked like you, Mommy," Colton added softly, "but her hair was dark." Tears streamed down Sonia's face as her mind raced to make sense of what she was hearing. Todd, too, felt shaken, his thoughts a swirl of wonder and disbelief. Could this be proof of heaven, A message from the beyond? Or was it something else entirely? They didn't have answers, but one thing was clear. Their son's story had changed everything. Colton's revelations didn't stop there. He told his parents about meeting his great-grandfather, a man he'd never known in life. Colton called him Pop and described him as youthful and full of energy. Curious, Todd dug out an old photograph of Pop and showed it to his son. Without missing a beat, Colton pointed at the picture. "That's him," he said with confidence. It was another moment that left Todd and Sonia stunned. For Todd, who had spent years as a pastor teaching about faith in the afterlife, his son's story was both a profound blessing and a test of everything he believed. Heaven had always been a cornerstone of his faith, but hearing Colton's vivid and detailed account made it feel more real than ever. For Sonia, the experience was deeply emotional, equal parts comforting and overwhelming. It gave her hope, stirred up old grief, and filled her with a sense of awe she couldn't quite put into words. Life in Imperial, Nebraska would never be the same for the Burpo family. What began as a terrifying medical emergency had turned into something far bigger, a story that defied logic, challenged their beliefs, and captured the hearts of everyone who heard it. Their quiet, small-town life had been forever transformed by what felt like a glimpse into another world, a journey through love, faith, and the unexplainable. It all started so casually, a small, offhand comment from 4-year-old Colton Burpo as he lay recovering in his hospital bed. But that simple remark was just the beginning of a story that would flip his parents' world upside down. As days passed, Colton's accounts grew even more detailed. He talked about heaven like it was a place he had truly been. He described angels everywhere, their songs so beautiful that they made him feel like he was floating. The light in heaven, he said, wasn't like any light on earth. It radiated from everything, wrapping him in a sense of warmth and peace. As weeks passed, Colton's insights grew even more puzzling. He began to explain heaven in ways that boggled his parents' minds. Time, he said, didn't work the way it does on earth. Everything happens at once, he said matter-of-factly, but it doesn't feel fast or slow, it just is. Todd and Sonia exchanged stunned glances. How could a 4-year-old grasp a concept so abstract, let alone explain it with such certainty? And then came the part that sent chills through them. Colton mentioned seeing people far away in conflict, fighting and hurting each other. He said Jesus told him it was because they needed to learn how to love each other more. If they don't, Colton said softly, things are going to get worse. The weight of his words lingered in the air, leaving Todd and Sonia speechless. What could this little boy have truly experienced to speak with such wisdom, clarity, and insight? The questions haunted them as they tried to piece together the extraordinary puzzle of their son's journey. But Colton's revelations didn't stop there. One day, out of the blue, he turned to Todd with a message that hit like a lightning bolt. "Jesus told me to tell you something," he said. Todd, expecting another innocent or comforting remark, nodded, bracing himself. But Colton's tone shifted, becoming serious in a way that felt far beyond his years. "He said you need to take your faith more seriously." Todd froze. As a pastor, he had dedicated his life to guiding others in their spiritual journeys. Yet here was his 4-year-old son, too young to even grasp the full weight of faith, delivering a pointed reminder that cut straight to Todd's own lingering doubts. How could Colton know about the quiet uncertainties Todd wrestled with in his heart? Then came another chilling remark from Colton, one that left Todd and Sonia reeling. "There's going to be a lot of fighting," he said quietly. "Jesus is sad about it. People need to change." His small voice carried a gravity that didn't seem to belong to a child. It was as though he had glimpsed something bigger, something he couldn't fully explain, but felt compelled to share. For Todd and Sonia, these moments cemented the belief that their son had experienced something truly extraordinary. Yet it also left them grappling with an endless stream of questions. Was Colton really offering them a glimpse of heaven? Or was his young mind trying to make sense of the trauma he had endured? Each story added another layer to the mystery, forcing them to confront everything they thought they understood about faith, life, and the world beyond. Colton's words lingered with them, challenging their hearts and reshaping their beliefs in ways they never could have anticipated. In the beginning, sharing Colton's story felt like the right thing to do. People from all over found comfort in his vivid descriptions of heaven, his encounters with angels, and his meeting with Jesus. Letters poured in, thanking the Burpos for offering proof that heaven was real. For a while, it seemed their story was a beacon of hope, but then the tide turned. Quiet whispers of doubt began to ripple through the community. Supporters started asking questions that planted seeds of skepticism. Could he really have seen all that? Some wondered. Others dismissed it as just a vivid dream. At first, Todd and Sonia tried to shrug it off, but the doubts grew louder. What if people misunderstood what Colton had gone through? The skepticism hit harder when Todd began sharing their story beyond their small-town circle. While many people were captivated, the critics weren't far behind. Some showed up with questions, but others hurled accusations. Couldn't Colton have overheard these stories in church? One man asked. Another woman, sharper with her words, said, "Why are you using your child like this?" For Sonia, that accusation cut deep. Exploiting their son? The thought stung. She hadn't even wanted to go public with the story in the first place. That had been Todd's decision, and now they were being painted as opportunists. The doubts weren't just coming from strangers either. Even some of their closest friends started keeping their distance, unsure what to believe. "I want to believe it," one friend said hesitantly. But what? Sonia couldn't understand why something so beautiful was so hard for people to accept. Then a publisher reached out with a proposal to turn Colton's story into a book. At first, the Burpos hesitated. Writing a book would only invite more scrutiny, more judgment. But after much prayer and reflection, they decided to go forward. It wasn't about fame or money. They believed sharing Colton's experience could inspire hope. Even as doubts swirled around them, the Burpos clung to their faith. They believed their story had the power to remind people of something bigger, even if not everyone was ready to believe it. When Heaven is for Real hit shelves, it was an instant phenomenon. The book skyrocketed to bestseller status, catapulting the Burpo family into a whirlwind of TV interviews, book signings, and public appearances. At first, it felt like their story was fulfilling its purpose, bringing hope and inspiration to others. But fame came with an unwelcome side effect: sharp criticism. Online detractors labeled their story as religious propaganda, accusing Todd and Sonia of exploiting their son, or worse, brainwashing him. The accusations were relentless, and many were deeply personal. Todd tried to brush off the negativity, but it was harder than he imagined. This wasn't just a theoretical debate about faith. It was about their family and the profoundly personal journey they had chosen to share. Even people in their own church began voicing doubts. One man bluntly asked, "Why does Colton's heaven look so much like the paintings we've all seen? It just seems too convenient." That word, convenient, stuck in Todd's mind, gnawing at him. Did people really think they had fabricated all this for fame or financial gain? Sure, the book had eased their financial burdens, but that had never been the goal. They shared Colton's story because they believed it had the power to change lives, to bring people closer to faith. As the criticism piled up, Todd started to second-guess their decision. Had they gone too far? Sonia, who shared his unease, tried to reassure him. "We know the truth. That's all that matters," she said. But Todd wasn't so sure anymore. One late night, he came across an online comment that hit him like a punch to the gut. "Where's the proof?" Faith wasn't about proof, but in a world that demanded it, was their story helping or hurting? The tension came to a head during a tough TV interview. The host, known for pulling no punches, asked Colton directly, "How do you know it wasn't just a dream?" Colton, now older and more confident, answered simply, "Because it felt real. Dreams go away, but I still remember everything." The host turned to Todd with a pointed question. "Don't you think Colton's experience was influenced by things he's heard in church?" Todd took a deep breath before responding. "I understand the doubts, but the details Colton shared, things he couldn't possibly have known, are what convinced us. He talked about family members he never met and described things he couldn't have seen while unconscious. That's not something we taught him." After the show, Sonia voiced the question weighing on both of their minds. Are we making things worse by talking about this? Todd didn't have an answer. Yet through all the backlash, Colton remained steady. To him, the truth was simple. I saw heaven, met Jesus, and came back with a message, he said one day. Jesus told me not to worry. People will believe when they're ready. Those words gave Todd some comfort, but the doubts lingered. What if their story was doing the opposite of what they had hoped? The question hung heavy in Todd's heart, a reminder of the delicate balance between belief and skepticism. When strangers began showing up at church, not to worship but to confront Todd, the weight of their story felt heavier than ever. One man even interrupted a service shouting, "You're leading people astray." For Todd, a pastor who had spent his life guiding others toward faith, the accusation hit like a dagger. For Sonia, the most painful part was watching Colton become a symbol rather than a child. He was just a boy, yet people projected their doubts, beliefs, and criticisms onto him. Protecting him from the world's harshness felt impossible, and the stress weighed heavily on her. Still, the Burpos didn't back down. They knew not everyone would believe, and that was okay. "We're not here to argue," Todd said during a particularly tough event. "We're here to share what happened. Believe it or not, that's your choice." Letters from readers who found hope in Colton's story kept pouring in, reminding them why they had shared it in the first place. "It's not about us," Todd reflected one evening. "It's about the message." That realization gave the family strength, but their journey was far from over. Colton's memories of heaven had always been a source of comfort and light for the Burpos. But as time went on, new details emerged that were harder to understand and much darker. It began on a quiet summer evening. Colton sat under the old oak tree in their backyard, uncharacteristically still. Sonia, watching from the kitchen window, felt uneasy. When she went outside to check on him, he didn't turn to look at her. His eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see. "Colton, are you okay?" she asked. "They're here," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Who's here?" Sonia asked, her chest tightening. Colton didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked back inside as though nothing had happened. But Sonia couldn't shake the chill that crept up her spine. In the weeks that followed, Colton withdrew further. His once joyful drawings of angels and golden gates turned into darker images, shadowy figures, swirling voids, and ominous shapes. One picture stopped Todd in his tracks. It showed a lone figure at the edge of a dark abyss, hands outstretched as though trying to stop something or someone from crossing. "What is this?" Todd asked, showing the drawing to Sonia. She felt a wave of dread. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but we need to talk to him." When they sat Colton down, he hesitated to explain. "It's just something I saw," he muttered, avoiding their eyes. "Where did you see it?" Todd pressed. "Before I came back," Colton admitted, his voice barely audible. The Burpos froze. They had always believed Colton's memories of heaven ended when he returned to his body. Now it seemed there was more, a part he hadn't shared. "What else do you remember?" Todd asked gently. Colton's face darkened. "There were places I wasn't supposed to go, but I saw them anyway." The room went silent. Todd and Sonia exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to say. As the days passed, more fragments emerged. Colton spoke of dark corridors, silent figures watching him, and a void that seemed to pull at everything around it. These weren't the warm, hopeful visions they had grown used to hearing. Todd turned to scripture, trying to reconcile Colton's words with his faith, but nothing seemed to fit. Sonia, meanwhile, felt an unsettling fear she couldn't shake. Colton began avoiding certain rooms in the house, saying they were too cold or too dark. When Todd asked why, Colton gave a chilling response. "They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Todd asked, his voice trembling. Colton didn't answer. The tension in the house grew thick, but Todd tried to dismiss it as stress. "We've been through a lot," he told Sonia, trying to convince himself as much as her. But deep down, they both knew something was off. One night, as Sonia tucked Colton into bed, he grabbed her hand and whispered, "They're closer now." "Who?" she asked, her voice shaking. "The Watchers," Colton said. "They're waiting for me to remember." Colton finally opened up one stormy evening. "I saw someone," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Who did you see?" Todd asked, leaning forward. "It wasn't Jesus," Colton said, his words sending a shiver down their spines. "It was something else." "What did they say?" Sonia asked, holding her breath. "They said I had to come back to warn people. They said things are coming, and people won't listen unless I tell them." "What things?" Todd pressed, his heart pounding. "I don't know," Colton admitted, shaking his head, "but they said it's important." The weight of Colton's words settled heavily on the Burpo family. This wasn't the hopeful message they had expected. It felt like a warning, cryptic, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Todd turned to Scripture for comfort, finding solace in Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." The next morning, he gathered his family in the living room. "We don't need all the answers," he said, his voice steady. "What matters is trusting God's purpose. Colton, your experience is a gift, even if it's hard to understand." Colton nodded, a small smile on his face. "Jesus told me not to worry," he said, "and I won't." From that day forward, the Burpos leaned on their faith, choosing trust over fear. They didn't have all the answers, but they believed Colton's journey was part of a bigger plan, one they didn't have to fully understand to embrace. For them, the truth remains simple. Heaven is real, love conquers all, and God's purpose is always good, even when the path feels uncertain. What choices do you think we can make today to bring a little more light into the world? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button for more.